When Cloud made his debut into Super Smash Bros. For the 3DS and Wii U, the amount of excitement and surprise echoing throughout the community was almost palpable. It was never out of the question if a Square Enix character could make it into the franchise, but to see it actually happen was truly a moment for the history books. Cloud's advent was marked by an incredibly successful competitive resume, ending the season as the second most powerful character, trailing behind Bayonetta. Needless to say, when Sephiroth came into Ultimate in what I might say was the most hype reveal trailer ever made before or since, initial reactions to him were just as optimistic, if not more so, given the enduring rivalry between him and Cloud. Just by looking at his trailer, top players ascertained that his overwhelming effective range would be near impossible to contest, and the sheer force behind his moves gave off the impression he would perpetuate the fighter's past due reputation, although that didn't really become a thing until Aegis and Kazuya were released. But even though he has a few high-profile wins from top players like Tweak, Ned, and Ken, Sephiroth has a notably small player base throughout all levels of competition, from your local weeklies to your international super majors, so I thought it would be a fun video to make. Today we'll be investigating one of the most polarizing characters throughout all of Smash in why no one plays Like all DLC fighters, Sephiroth's identity is tied to his unique mechanics, one of which being the only thing allowing him to be tournament viable in the first place, albeit with some inconsistent results. The first mechanic is most conspicuously his extreme range by virtue of his iconic Masamune, sporting more effective reach than even the Belmonts and Shulk, only really surpassed by Min Min, but I mean that's saying a lot. Sephiroth's attack reach is so long that it inadvertently causes many of his attacks to be virtually unpunishable on shield if perfectly spaced, purely because the majority of the cast doesn't have an add a shield option long enough to strike back. To offset his insane range, he has varying sweet and sour spots based on how he strikes and where. When using any stabbing moves like forward air or up tilt, the farthest one-third of the sword is the strongest point, so those moves basically have Marth's tipper. Meanwhile, any swing or slash type attacks such as back air or forward tilt are at their strongest at the middle of the sword, similar to Roy's inverse tipper. Then again, the immense length of the sword allows Sephiroth's middle hitbox to still outrange other swordies altogether. That's how wide the gap is. However, there are no sword attacks that are strongest when used up close, which is important for reasons I'll talk about later. His other defining aspect is his unique property, also referred to by the community as his DLC mechanic, One Way. Upon reaching around 90%, fluctuating either upwards or downwards based on if he's ahead or behind, he gains a set amount of bonuses that can only be described as a combination of Cloud's Limit and Joker's Arsene. Along with letting him double jump twice in the air, all of his attacks deal 1.3 times more damage, resulting in him having some of the highest damage output in the game. And he gains a significant boost to his already impressive mobility, far more than even Cloud's Limit. Additionally, his smash attacks gain heavy armor, being able to withstand up to 20% without interrupting his animation. A core part of what makes Sephiroth such a terrifying opponent is that he fundamentally disobeys the range and speed rule. Typically, when a character has really high effective range, such as a projectile user like Samus or the Belmonts, a major point of weakness to them is their poor ground and or air physics. This trait is a cornerstone of the Zoner class across all fighting games. It wouldn't be very fair for someone to have the range pressure of Samus while being as fast as Sonic, now would it? Sephiroth may not be a projectile camper, but his disjointed range spans far enough that you'd be hard-pressed to call it a sword. It's basically a glorified melee projectile at that point. Yet even so, his mobility is quite good, and with one wing active, it's among the best overall. Sephiroth is able to maneuver just as fluidly as Cloud and Roy with almost double their range and damage output. Not only does Sephiroth break the rules that keep zoners in check, but he also kind of breaks the rules that keep swordies in check as well. Granted, not all of them, but for those who play and or play against a good Sephiroth, he sorta gets away with a lot of things that other swordies would be heavily punished for. A good example being shield pressure. Sword fighters have generally poor grab games, lacking either combo or kill throws, so in most situations, the easiest defensive measure against a swordy is to hold shield against them. You may not necessarily be able to punish their attacks, but it forces them to find other ways to break through your defense. Sephiroth on the other hand has Down Smash, a near instant shield breaker, and he also has 3 somewhat reliable combo throws in the form of down, back, and up throw. Through Shadow Flare, he can pressure his opponents into a lose-lose situation as they now have to contend with the orbiting flames and him at the same time. Also, despite his frailty, Sephiroth's recovery is quite impressive, another weakness swordies are well known for. It's understandable as to why top players had a favorable opinion towards him. When you take a look at all the character's pros, it bears a lot of resemblance to how overbearing Cloud was in Smash 4. Thing is, all those bypasses come with their own problems, namely that in exchange for having lots of unique strengths, Sephiroth has a lot of unique weaknesses of his own. Chief among them is that he's pretty much the only long-range character with a melee dead zone. Zoners and trappers may have poor mobility in general, but that doesn't mean they lack the means to fight up close and personal. Quite the opposite, they're actually notorious for having get-off-me tools. For instance, Samus has access to Screw Attack, a frame 6 up special that can attack both sides of her. The Belmonts also have a frame 6 get off me tool in the form of their Rising Uppercut. Link is a frame 7 up B and a frame 10 neutral air at a shield. Pac-Man has a frame 6 nair at a shield and a frame 8 forward air at a shield. Snake has tons of out of shield options to choose from. Min Min has a frame 11 nair at a shield if using Ram Ram and a frame 8 up smash, so even if you find a way through their barrage of projectiles and disjoints, you still have to be careful with how you approach them when getting up close, as they can very easily throw you back out. The one exception to this is Sephiroth, who is quite possibly the worst close quarters combat in the game. The fastest out of shield option he has is neutral air at frame 12. It's not the worst, but Rising Nair doesn't exactly lead into anything and it has rather short range, only hitting in a circle around him, and since it's a rising aerial, there's a chance he may not be able to hit low profile targets such as short height characters like Greninja and Pikachu, or characters who pancake on falling aerials like Cloud. Aside from that, Sephiroth may honestly have the worst out of shield game period, something desperately needed to survive considering most of the game's top tiers are members of the Rushdown archetype: Joker, Sheik, Roy, Fox, Mythra, and Sonic to name a few. Not being able to escape pressure is a weakness that by itself prevents you from ever being a top tier character. Ultimate is a game predicated on advantage state and punish game, and add a shield option is good for both as it prevents the opponent from exerting pressure on you while you get to punish them for trying to attack you. This forces Sephiroth to play exclusively mid to long range combat. Granted, that's pretty easy to do thanks to his aforementioned combination of range and speed, but there's one thing about said range that doesn't make it quite as reliable as it looks. Something I should clarify is that there's a difference between range and coverage. Range entails how far your character can attack, whereas coverage denotes the total area your attacks cover. Take Sephiroth's forward air, it's a forward thrust, probably the longest forward air in the game. However, it has a very thin hitbox, making it rather precise, whereas Ike's forward air is an overhead arcing slash. It may not reach as far, but it covers more area by attacking above him, in front of him, as well as below him. In most situations, you would rather have Ike's forward air since it has a wider margin for error. You don't need pinpoint accuracy to land this attack. Now, I'm aware that Sephiroth's forward air is not as difficult to land as I'm making it sound, seeing as it has 6 active frames, so if using it while landing, it covers a pretty decent area, but my point still stands. Most of Sephiroth's fast attacks, I say fast in air quotes, are precise. Forward tilt, back air, up tilt. You usually have to be right on the money to land those moves. Regarding his more generous hitboxes, they're pretty laggy, such as up air or up smash, not something you can spam as often. While Sephiroth's attacks have unreasonably good range, they're not as conducive towards the defensive spacing playstyle when compared to more traditional swordies like the Fire Emblem characters. Opponents who can approach very quickly will squeeze through your blind spots even if you try to keep them away from you. In other words, you could be doing a great job spacing your attacks and keeping distance, and still get gap closed on because your attacks have poor coverage. The absence of reliable defensive measures adds more insult to injury when you account for how ridiculously light he is. Not only does Sephiroth share the same weight as motherfucking Kirby, but he's more than twice his height, being one of the easiest characters to hit, especially with landing and rising aerials. Sephiroth just dies, not by a small margin either. We're talking he usually dies 30% earlier than most others. Of course, his weight is there to balance out his extreme offense, but that compounds how volatile of a character he is. Sephiroth has amazing offensive stats like mobility, range, and power, but abysmal defensive stats like out of shield options, hurtbox size, and weight. In competitive fighting games, high polarity tends to work against their viability more often than not due to resulting in inconsistency. It doesn't matter how high your highs are if your lows are just as low. For Sephiroth's case, his weaknesses may be more pronounced than his strengths. Low durability, poor disadvantage state, inconsistent hitboxes, and some of the worst overall frame data in the game cause more harm than what good range, high damage, strong advantage state, and pressure can make up for. If anything, I feel like in the realm of competitive Smash, a character's value isn't measured by how much damage they do or how good their combo game is, it's quantified by how safe they are. Not as in safety on shield, just safety in terms of exploitation. You can exploit the hell out of Sephiroth, but it's harder to exploit a Joker or Sonic. On the subject of weaknesses overshadowing strengths, let's talk about his comeback mechanic. On paper, One Wing might actually be the best out of all the comeback mechanics if you think about it. It gives you a third jump, that alone speaks volumes. On top of that, you get a 30% increase in damage across the board and a big boost to your mobility. Joker's Arsene only gives him more damage and slightly adjusted hitboxes to his attacks. He doesn't gain more mobility or a second jump. Cloud gets a big boost to mobility and a single-use empowered special, but he doesn't get more damage on his normals, and it only lasts 13 seconds, although he can reacquire it on demand. Terry's Go button only gives him empowered specials and nothing else. Overall, if we're purely talking about bonuses, Sephiroth's One Wing is the best comeback mechanic. That being said, in practice, I find it to be the least impactful comeback mechanic in the game in terms of payout. Let me explain. See, the point of a comeback mechanic is to offer a substantial, albeit artificial, and temporary boost in pressure in the hopes that they can use that temporary boost to close the gap between the players. And while Sephiroth's One Wing is most certainly capable of doing so, the problem with it is that it doesn't alleviate his weaknesses in any way. Joker's Arsene grants him a major amp, but if he's getting his ass kicked before Arsene, he's gonna still get his ass kicked after, because all Arsene, and by extension One Wing, does is amplify your strength. It doesn't compensate for anything. Cloud's Limit, on the other hand, can be used to save him from certain death by augmenting Climaster to be a much more effective recovery tool. It turns Blade Beam, a relatively harmless projectile, into a dangerous kill move that also 2-frames and hits Ledge Hang. It turns Cross Slash, a damage tracking tool, into one of the most powerful whiff punishes in the game. Terry's Go button offers 2 brand new attacks that are situationally effective. Meanwhile, Sephiroth gains no new attacks or even new properties to his attacks outside of heavy armor. He does get a 3rd jump, which is significant, make no mistake, but if he's in a losing situation, nothing from One Wing will push him out of it. Personally, I consider One Wing to be a win more mechanic, not a comeback mechanic, something to widen your lead rather than close the gap. Occasionally it might help you get back to ledge or get a shield break once in a blue moon, but it doesn't offer any immediate relief. If instead all of Sephiroth's grounded moves had heavy armor and not just the smash attacks, that would be a different story. One more thing, the sheer power boost he gets from One Wing is somewhat pointless when you remember that he's usually one strong hit away from dying once he gets Wing. Joker gets his first Arsene naturally at around 60%, so he has plenty of time to use it. Terry and Kazuya achieve their comeback status at 100% or higher, but Terry's a heavyweight and Kazuya is a super heavy. They can realistically sustain a good 40 to 50% more damage before they actually die, whereas I've seen Sephiroth get knocked out at double-digit %. It's sort of like the Lucario problem, where you're strongest when at kill percent, but there's a very high likelihood you'll die before you get to weaponize that strength, if at all. Furthermore, because One Wing disappears after you dealt a certain amount of percent, if hypothetically you're down 3 stocks to 1 and you get One Wing, you'll only sustain its effects for your opponent's first and second stock, as by their last stock, provided you made it that far, the game will have detected that you dealt enough damage even though you're still behind, forcing you to have to play that final crucial stock without Wing. The long and short of it is, Sephiroth is a defensive glass cannon, which is as counterintuitive as it sounds. Normally, glass cannons can overcome their frailty by exerting so much offensive pressure on their opponent that they'll have no opportunity to capitalize on it. But Sephiroth is a glass cannon who has to play a very spacing defensive game due to having awful close quarters combat. Now, if played optimally and consistently, he can be an impossible wall to break through, and you'll feel absolutely hopeless when he has a situational advantage, especially when backed into a corner like in ledge trap scenarios. But just as he can smother his opponents can smother him too. And like I said, to be successful in Smash, it's not so much how aggressive you are, but rather how well you can respond to aggression, and Sephiroth really can't. That being said, he's still a firmly high tier character, partly thanks to one virtue. Like Cloud, being a swordy with safe on shield aerials and good spacing in tandem with excellent mobility is a good combination to have against Ultimate's growing aggro punish meta. Sephiroth performs excellently against trappers and whiff punishers like Kazuya, Steve, Pac-Man, Rob, Snake, and so on, because against slower characters, he gets to decide the pace of the match. In essence, while it's too risky to field him as your primary, Sephiroth is definitely a worthwhile counterpick secondary. He's got the perfect balance of speed, power, and range to deal with all those so-called annoying characters that everyone hates fighting. And though he does have a lot of weird gimmicks you have to get used to, he's still pretty straightforward. That likely explains why Tweak, Ned, and Ken have been using him quite often as of late. Not many people play him right now, but I have a feeling that might change in the near future. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you have, it would be awesome if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.